A tourist vanished without a trace in the vast wilderness of Alaska, her disappearance becoming just another cold case in the unforgiving northern frontier. 7 years later, her body emerged from beneath the melting ice, stone weights still bound to her feet, revealing a truth far more sinister than anyone had imagined. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. On a crisp July morning in 2016, Margaret Turner zipped up her weatherproof jacket and adjusted the straps of her meticulously packed backpack one final time. The small town of Talkeetna was just beginning to stir as she stepped out of her rented cabin, the air crisp with promise and pine. At 62, the recently retired teacher from Seattle was finally pursuing the dream she had postponed for decades, a solo adventure into Alaska's untamed wilderness. For just 2 weeks, she had told her daughter Emily during their last phone call. 2 weeks to find what I've been looking for all these years. What exactly that was, Margaret couldn't quite articulate, but after 35 years of guiding young minds through literature and mathematics, she craved the profound silence that only nature could provide. The Susitna River glimmered in the distance as Margaret made her way to her parked car. She had spent months preparing for this journey, studying topographical maps until she could trace the contours in her sleep, taking wilderness survival courses from seasoned guides, and assembling a backpack containing everything from bear spray to a satellite phone that she promised Emily she would use each evening. "Good morning. Heading out early?" called the owner of the grocery store, sweeping the wooden porch as Margaret passed. The mountains are waiting," she replied with a smile that revealed both excitement and determination. Her silver-streaked hair was pulled back in a practical braid, her experienced hands double-checking the compass hanging from her neck. Margaret had always prided herself on her independence. Widowed at 45, she had raised Emily alone while maintaining her teaching career and her passion for outdoor adventures. But those had always been calculated day trips or guided excursions, never the solitary immersion she now sought. In her journal the previous night, she had written, "Tomorrow, I step beyond the boundaries I've set for myself. Alaska isn't just a place. It's the test I've been preparing for my entire life." As she loaded her gear into her vehicle, Margaret reviewed her itinerary one final time. She had filed her route with the local ranger station, marked check-in points, and calculated distances between shelters. Her attention to detail was legendary among her former colleagues, and she applied that same methodical approach to this journey. What Margaret couldn't have known as she drove toward the trailhead that morning, her eyes bright with anticipation, was that the wilderness she so respected would soon become both her sanctuary and her greatest challenge. The Alaskan landscape stretched before her, vast, beautiful, and utterly indifferent to human plans. Margaret Turner's first day in the Alaskan wilderness passed without incident. The early morning sun cast long shadows across the pavement as she pulled her vehicle into the only gas station on the outskirts of Talkeetna. The security camera mounted above the entrance captured her methodical movements, checking her map one final time, adjusting her hiking boots, and scanning the horizon with eager anticipation. While filling her tank, Margaret noticed a tall man in a worn red plaid shirt watching her from beside the air pump. He approached with an easy smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. The camera footage later revealed their brief interaction, him gesturing enthusiastically toward the distant peaks, her nodding politely. Though the footage had no audio, investigators would later identify this man as Lucas Bennett, his Canadian accent charming yet somehow out of place in the small Alaskan town. "The Northern Trail offers better views," he seemed to suggest, pointing toward a section of wilderness not marked on standard tourist maps. Margaret appeared to thank him before driving away, her expression thoughtful as she considered this unexpected advice. For the next 48 hours, nothing seemed amiss. Margaret had promised to check in with Emily each evening, and she kept her word, describing breathtaking vistas and the profound silence of the wilderness. Her last message mentioned setting up camp near a small tributary of the Susitna River, where the fishing looked promising. Then, silence. When Margaret missed her scheduled check-in, park rangers organized a search party. They followed her planned route and discovered her campsite on the morning of the third day. Detective Samuel Clark would later describe the scene as unnervingly pristine. Her sleeping bag lay perfectly folded inside the tent. The portable stove had been cleaned and cooled. Her hiking boots stood aligned at the tent entrance, as if awaiting their owner's return. A half-written entry in her journal described the sound of rushing water and plans to photograph wildlife at dawn. Her car keys rested atop the notebook. Even her water bottle sat upright beside the tent, still half full. The rangers called her name into the vast wilderness, their voices swallowed by the dense forest and rushing water. They found no signs of struggle, no evidence of animal intrusion. It was as if Margaret Turner had simply stepped away from her campsite, perhaps to admire a view or collect water from the nearby stream, and vanished into the untamed Alaskan landscape, leaving behind everything except the clothes she wore. The news of Margaret Turner's disappearance spread through Talkeetna like wildfire. Within hours of her abandoned campsite being discovered, search parties mobilized with remarkable speed. Local rangers, led by a grim-faced coordinator, established a command post near the last known location where Margaret had been seen. "We need to cover every inch of this riverbank," the coordinator instructed, unfolding detailed topographical maps across the hood of his vehicle. Volunteers from town arrived in droves, fishermen who knew every bend of the Susitna River, shopkeepers who had exchanged pleasantries with the retired teacher just days before, and even tourists who postponed their own adventures to help find the missing woman. They fanned out along the muddy banks, calling Margaret's name until their voices grew hoarse. The thick Alaskan wilderness seemed to swallow their shouts, returning nothing but the occasional cry of a distant bird or the constant gurgle of the flowing water. Search dogs sniffed at her belongings, then led their handlers toward the river before losing the scent where the water lapped against the shore. Detective Samuel Clark arrived on the second day, his experienced eyes scanning the scene methodically. "The footprints tell us something," he muttered to his deputy, crouching to examine faint impressions in the soft earth. The tracks showed Margaret had walked, not run, toward the water's edge, disappearing where slick stones created a natural pathway into the river. Tangled willow roots nearby revealed nothing caught in their grasp, no torn clothing or personal items that might suggest a struggle. She either crossed intentionally, or... The detective left the alternative unspoken, his gaze drifting to the swift current. For 5 consecutive days, helicopters buzzed overhead while kayakers navigated the treacherous rapids downstream. Authorities documented everything meticulously: photographs of the undisturbed campsite, plaster casts of the partial footprints, statements from everyone who might have encountered Margaret in her final days. A park ranger discovered a trail log 15 miles upriver with Margaret's neat handwriting. "Beautiful sunset over the valley, heading back to camp tomorrow." The entry suggested no fear, no premonition of danger. As July gave way to August, the search gradually lost momentum. Summer tourists began departing, and the seasonal rangers prepared for reassignment. The dense undergrowth that had been trampled by searchers started to recover, erasing whatever subtle clues might have remained. By the time autumn painted the landscape in fiery hues, Margaret Turner's disappearance had become another unsolved mystery of the Alaskan wilderness, a case file that would remain open but inactive as the trail, like the footprints by the river, grew cold beneath falling leaves. Margaret's family refused to accept the uncertainty. Emily Turner, Margaret's only daughter, channeled her grief into action, returning to Talkeetna every July like clockwork. The anniversary of her mother's disappearance became a pilgrimage of hope rather than mourning. "I know she's out there somewhere," Emily would tell anyone who would listen, her voice steady despite the shadows under her eyes. She organized candlelight vigils that dotted the banks of the Susitna River with flickering light, transforming the place of loss into one of remembrance. The local grocery store owner, though initially hesitant, eventually kept a permanent space in his window for Margaret's flyers. "It's the least I can do," he'd say, adjusting the paper that showed Margaret's smiling face, a retired teacher with bright eyes that seemed to look directly at passers-by. The bakery across the street did the same, offering Emily free coffee whenever she came to refresh the weathered notices. Talkeetna's response to Emily's persistence was complicated. The tight-knit community, accustomed to the harsh realities of Alaskan wilderness, viewed outsiders with a mixture of welcome and wariness. Some residents embraced Emily's cause, joining her searches and offering their local knowledge of the changing river patterns. "The land takes people sometimes," an elderly fisherman told her during her third summer visit, "but it also gives up its secrets, if you're patient enough." Others maintained a polite distance, their compassion tempered by unspoken suspicions. At the local diner, conversations would hush when Emily entered, then resume with careful neutrality. Some believed Margaret had simply underestimated the wilderness, a common mistake among tourists, no matter how prepared they seemed. "Grizzlies don't care how many survival courses you've taken," one hunting guide remarked over his coffee. The darker whispers came later in the evenings, when the summer sun finally dipped below the horizon. Stories circulated about drifters who followed the seasonal work, predators who knew the backcountry better than any ranger. A few remembered the tall stranger in plaid who'd been seen talking to Margaret at the gas station. Here one season, gone the next. Detective Clark kept Emily informed of developments, though they grew increasingly rare as months stretched into years. "We haven't forgotten," he assured her during their annual meeting, reviewing the thin file that contained Margaret's case. Emily nodded, understanding the unspoken reality. Without new evidence, her mother would remain one of Alaska's many mysteries, another name on the list of those who ventured into the wilderness and never returned. As the investigation into Margaret Turner's disappearance entered its second year, public interest waned. The front-page headlines that once dominated the Talkeetna Gazette gradually shifted to the back pages, buried beneath stories of town developments and seasonal festivals. The official police report now carried the sterile classification, "unexplained disappearance." Emily Turner refused to let her mother's memory fade into obscurity. Each July, she would drive the long, winding road from Seattle to Talkeetna, her car packed with newly printed flyers bearing Margaret's smiling face. A small but dedicated group of friends, mostly former colleagues of her mother, would join her annual pilgrimage, setting up a command center at the local bakery. "We won't stop until we know what happened," Emily would tell anyone who would listen, her determination unwavering despite the sympathetic yet increasingly distant looks from locals. She established a website, Finding Margaret, which chronicled every detail of her mother's last known movements and compiled tips from hikers who ventured into the same wilderness. Detective Samuel Clark maintained occasional contact with Emily, calling when the seasonal changes might yield new search opportunities. But even his calls became less frequent as other cases demanded his attention. The detective kept Margaret's file on his desk, however, unwilling to relegate it entirely to the cold case archives. Meanwhile, Alaska itself was changing. Climate scientists noted the increasingly rapid spring thaws, with winter's grip loosening earlier each year. The Susitna River, once predictable in its seasonal patterns, now surged with unprecedented force during the melt. Its banks eroded faster, its course subtly altering with each passing season. Local fishermen like Thomas Baker noticed the changes first. Was it the rivers eating away at places that used to be solid ground? He remarked to friends at the grocery store. Found an old fishing rod last week that must have been buried for years. The shifting landscape occasionally sparked renewed hope. Every newly exposed riverbank or collapsed tree brought the possibility of answers. Emily would receive excited calls from Talkeetna residents who spotted unusual debris, only to face disappointment when investigation revealed ordinary wilderness detritus. The town's relationship with Margaret's story evolved too. What began as an all-hands community search effort gradually transformed into a cautionary tale. Parents told their children about wilderness safety. Some locals still placed fresh flowers beneath the missing person poster that remained permanently affixed to the bakery's bulletin board. As the 5th anniversary of Margaret's disappearance approached, even Emily struggled to maintain the same intensity of hope. But she continued updating the website, organizing the annual search, and scanning the increasingly unstable banks of the Susitna, unaware that the river's accelerating changes would soon reveal what winter had kept hidden for years. The spring of 23 brought an unprecedented thaw to Alaska. Climate scientists had warned about it for months, but nothing prepared Talkeetna for the spectacle that unfolded on that crisp March morning. The Susitna River, which had remained frozen in stubborn silence all winter, suddenly split with a thunderous crack that echoed through the valley like a gunshot. Thomas Baker had been fishing these waters for over 30 years. The 62-year-old fisherman knew every bend and eddy of the river like the wrinkles on his weathered face. That morning, he'd ventured farther downstream than usual, hoping to scout new fishing spots where the thaw had reshaped the riverbed. "The ice is breaking earlier every year," he muttered to himself, carefully navigating the slippery banks. The rushing water carried chunks of ice, fallen branches, and river stones in its powerful current. Thomas watched as boulders and driftwood tumbled downstream, revealing sections of riverbed that hadn't seen daylight in decades. It was near a newly formed curve in the river that something caught his eye, an unnatural shape tangled among the exposed rocks. At first, he thought it was just another piece of trash carried downstream from careless campers. But as he drew closer, his heart began to pound against his ribs. A duffel bag, its once bright fabric now faded to a ghostly grey, lay wedged between two large stones. What struck Thomas as immediately wrong was how it was bound, tightly wrapped with weathered ropes in an elaborate pattern. The bag seemed deliberately weighted down with several large stones secured inside. The fisherman's calloused hands trembled as he pulled out his pocket knife. Years on fishing boats had taught him to recognize knots, and these weren't simple ones. They were methodical, purposeful, maritime knots that seemed out of place this far inland. As Thomas cut through the last cord, the bag loosened, revealing something etched on its side. He wiped away years of silt and grime with his thumb, exposing two faded initials. M.T. Margaret Turner, he whispered, the name hanging in the cold air like a ghost. 7 years had passed since the retired teacher had vanished without a trace. But everyone in Talkeetna remembered. Thomas had joined the search parties himself, combing these very banks until hope had faded like footprints in the snow. He sat back on his heels, the knife still clutched in his hand. The river continued its relentless flow around him, indifferent to the secret it had finally surrendered. Thomas knew that with this discovery, the peaceful rhythm of their small Alaskan town was about to be shattered once again. The discovery of the weathered duffel bag sent shockwaves through Talkeetna's quiet community. Within hours, Sheriff Donovan had assembled a team including Detective Samuel Clark and 2 specialists from the Alaska State Troopers' Cold Case Unit. They worked methodically, photographing the site where Thomas Baker had made his grim discovery before carefully transporting the evidence to the local station. Under the harsh fluorescent lights of the makeshift investigation room, the team gently unpacked the contents. The duffel bag, once bright blue, but now faded to a ghostly grey, contained several items preserved by Alaska's frigid temperatures. A set of neatly folded clothes, still bearing traces of Margaret Turner's preferred lavender detergent, a leather-bound journal with pages warped by moisture but largely intact, and a stainless steel water bottle covered in unusual scratches that didn't appear random. "These look deliberate," Detective Clark murmured, turning the bottle under the light. "Almost like someone was trying to mark something." The maritime knots used to secure the bag particularly caught his attention, his fingers tracing their unusual pattern with growing concern. Emily Turner arrived the following morning, having caught the first flight from Seattle after receiving the call. 7 years of hoping had etched permanent lines around her eyes, but she carried herself with the same determined posture as her mother. The detective watched her carefully as she entered the room, noting how she braced herself before approaching the table where Margaret's belongings lay. "That's her journal," Emily whispered, reaching out but stopping just short of touching it. She wrote in it every night, said it kept her thoughts organized. Her voice trembled slightly as she identified each item, confirming what they already suspected. When she picked up the water bottle, Emily's composure momentarily cracked. She got this when she retired. The teachers at her school all signed it. Her fingers traced over the strange markings that now obscured those signatures. These weren't there before. Relief briefly flickered across her face. Finally, tangible proof that her mother hadn't simply vanished into thin air. Yet that relief quickly gave way to the crushing realization that these items had been deliberately hidden, weighted down with stones in the river's cold depths. Each breath Emily took seemed labored, as though the pain of old wounds reopening was physically constricting her chest. Detective Clark placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "This is just the beginning," he assured her. "We're going to reopen everything. These items tell us someone else was involved, someone who didn't want these things found." Emily nodded, her eyes never leaving the journal. "She wouldn't have gone without leaving some kind of message," she said softly. "My mother always found a way to communicate." Detective Samuel Clark examined the duffel bag with careful precision, his experienced eyes narrowing as he studied the intricate knots securing it. 23 years in law enforcement had taught him to notice details others missed, and these weren't ordinary knots. He ran his fingers along the weathered rope, feeling the complex pattern beneath his touch. These aren't local," he muttered to the forensic technician documenting the evidence. "Our river fishermen use simple hitches and loops. These are specialized maritime knots. Bowlines and sheet bends. Someone with significant boating experience tied these." The detective pulled out his notebook, jotting down observations as Emily Turner watched anxiously from across the room. Samuel had seen that look before, the desperate hope for answers, warring with fear of what those answers might reveal. "The way these stones were secured," he continued, "shows deliberate intent. Someone wanted this bag to stay submerged permanently." This revelation dramatically narrowed their suspect pool. Talkeetna's visitor logs from summer 2016 showed only 3 people with documented maritime backgrounds. 2 had solid alibis. One had departed on a documented flight before Margaret's disappearance, and another had been hospitalized in Anchorage. That left someone operating under the radar, someone who'd entered the small Alaskan town but never officially left. Back at the station, Samuel spread maps across his desk, cross-referencing witness statements with known locations. The maritime connection triggered a memory from the initial investigation, a transient selling handcrafted items at the summer market. Items that several locals mentioned featured nautical themes. "Emily," he called, "did your mother ever mention meeting someone with sailing experience?" She flipped through the journal pages, stopping suddenly. "There's a note here about a man who told her stories about fishing in the Northwest Passage. She described his accent as Canadian." Samuel pulled the immigration records. Several Canadian nationals had crossed into Alaska that summer, but only one fit their emerging profile, Lucas Bennett, who had entered through the northern border crossing but had no record of departure. The detective pinned Bennett's grainy border photo to his evidence board. The man's weathered face and calculating eyes stared back, revealing nothing. "He knew these waters," Samuel said, tapping the map where the Susitna River curved through the wilderness, "and he knew how to disappear in them." The detective closed his notebook, a grim determination settling over him. The river had finally surrendered one secret, but Lucas Bennett remained a ghost, a shadow who had slipped through their fingers 7 years ago, leaving behind only his handiwork in those distinctive knots. Emily Turner's hands trembled as she turned the pages of her mother's journal. For 7 years, these weathered notes had been her only connection to Margaret. Now, with renewed determination after the discovery of the duffel bag, she scrutinized every word, looking for anything she might have missed. On page 37, Emily paused. Margaret Turner had marked a trail that didn't appear on any official maps, a narrow path that veered away from the established routes near the Susitna River. The entry was dated just 2 days before her disappearance. "We've met an interesting man named Lucas today," Margaret had written in her neat, precise handwriting. "Canadian accent, knows these woods well. Suggested an alternate route with better views of the mountain range. Says tourists never find these special places. Might try his suggestion tomorrow." Emily's heart raced. This was the first concrete mention of someone who might have interacted with her mother in those final days. She immediately called Detective Samuel Clark, who added this information to his growing file. "Lucas," the detective repeated thoughtfully. "That name has come up before." Over the next 3 days, Emily pieced together witness accounts from locals who remembered that summer. The bakery owner recalled a man with a Canadian accent who would come in for coffee every morning. The elderly couple who ran the grocery store mentioned a traveler who asked detailed questions about hiking trails. Most significantly, 3 different residents remembered Lucas at the weekend market, selling handmade wooden trinkets and jewelry crafted from local materials. He had set up his small booth near the edge of the market, positioning himself perfectly to observe everyone who passed by. "He was friendly enough," said one woman who had purchased a carved bear from him, "but something about his eyes never seemed right. Always watching, calculating." Another vendor remembered how Lucas would engage tourists in conversation, particularly women traveling alone. He'd offer advice about secret spots only locals knew about, the man told Emily. Said he'd been living in the area for years, though none of us had seen him before that summer. Emily brought these accounts back to Detective Clark, who matched them against the maritime knots found on the duffel bag. The pattern was becoming clearer and more disturbing. That night, Emily reread her mother's final entries, searching for any hint of suspicion or fear. Margaret had been cautious but trusting, detailed but open to adventure. The perfect target for someone who knew how to gain confidence quickly. "Mom," Emily whispered to the silent pages, "what did he do to you?" A new breakthrough emerged when Thomas Baker shared his old digital photos with Detective Samuel Clark. The fisherman had been documenting river changes that summer for his personal records, never realizing he'd captured something crucial. In the background of one image dated July 9th, 2016, the very day Margaret Turner vanished, a weathered rowboat was visible, tied loosely to a willow tree near the riverbank. "I never thought much of it," Thomas explained. his weathered hands trembling slightly as he zoomed in on the image. Boats come and go along these shores. But this one disappeared right after that woman went missing. The detective studied the photograph intently. The vessel was distinctive, patched in several places with what appeared to be marine-grade tape, its wooden hull stained dark from years of use. Most telling was a small red marking on its side, possibly initials or a symbol, though too blurry to identify clearly. When cross-referenced with witness statements, this discovery gained significance. 2 hikers had mentioned seeing a man resembling Lucas Bennett rowing upstream 3 days before Margaret's disappearance. The Canadian traveller had claimed to be scouting fishing spots, but now his movements took on a more sinister dimension. Armed with this new evidence, the investigation team expanded their search parameters. The spring thaw had dramatically altered the river's course, exposing sections that had been inaccessible during the initial search 7 years earlier. The Susitna's waters had receded in some areas, while carving deeper channels in others. "We need to focus on these deeper pools," Samuel instructed the search team, pointing to a topographical map. The current would have naturally carried heavier objects downstream to these collection points. Emily Turner joined the renewed effort, her determination undiminished by years of disappointment. She walked the shores daily, scanning the newly exposed riverbed with a practiced eye. The locals, once skeptical of outsiders, now greeted her with solemn nods of recognition. "The river keeps secrets," an elderly resident told her one evening at the grocery store, "but it can't keep them forever." The search team employed new technology unavailable during the initial investigation: underwater drones capable of navigating the murky depths and ground-penetrating radar to examine sediment layers. They methodically mapped each section of the river, convinced that crucial evidence had been overlooked or deliberately hidden beneath the rushing waters. What they didn't yet realize was how completely the landscape had conspired to protect its secrets, and how thoroughly the thawing ice would eventually betray them. Emily Turner sat in her hotel room, surrounded by photocopies of her mother's journal pages. Each time a new piece of evidence emerged, she felt the same nauseating mixture of hope and dread. Hope that she might finally understand what happened to Margaret Turner. Dread that the truth might be worse than the uncertainty she'd lived with for 7 years. "I heard something outside the tent again last night," she read aloud from her mother's neat handwriting. "Probably just a fox or maybe even a moose passing through. Still, I can't shake the feeling of being watched." Emily's fingers trembled as she turned to the final entry. "I'd met that Canadian traveller again today, Lucas. Friendly enough, though something about his questions seemed odd. He knows these trails better than the guidebooks. Offered to show me a shortcut tomorrow. I'll stick to my original route, safer that way." Across town, Detective Samuel Clark pinned photographs to his evidence board. The maritime knots used to secure Margaret's duffel bag had become his obsession. They weren't the simple overhand knots a hiker might use, but complex bindings that spoke of years on the water. "These are specialized," he explained to his colleague. "We've narrowed it down to 5 seasonal workers who were in Talkeetna that summer with maritime experience." The detective tapped a grainy image captured from the gas station security camera. Lucas Bennett, Canadian passport, crossed the border in June 2016. No record of him leaving Alaska officially. Clark spread out Bennett's sparse file. A 35-year-old drifter who picked up odd jobs at docks and marinas across the Pacific Northwest. No criminal record, but several informal complaints from female hikers about his persistent offers to guide them on secret trails. "He fits our profile perfectly," Clark said. "Transient, knowledgeable about the area, maritime background, and, most damning, he disappeared right after Margaret did." Emily received a call from the detective that evening. As he explained their findings about Lucas Bennett, She felt a cold certainty settle in her stomach. "Your mother was careful," Clark said gently. "Her journal shows she sensed something wasn't right. She tried to protect herself." "But it wasn't enough," Emily whispered. "We've put out an international alert for Bennett. He was spotted in British Columbia 6 months after your mother disappeared, then vanished from official records. Probably using a different name now." Emily closed her eyes, picturing her mother alone in that vast wilderness, trusting her instincts, but perhaps not quite enough. The diary entries revealed Margaret Turner's growing unease, yet also her determination to complete the journey she'd dreamed of for decades. "She wouldn't back down," Emily said. But that wasn't who she was. The breakthrough arrived on a misty Tuesday morning when a local hunting guide stumbled upon a weathered, leather-bound journal in an abandoned hunter's shelter. The small wooden structure sat along the remote trail Margaret Turner had carefully marked in her own diary. Detective Samuel Clark arrived at the scene within hours, his breath forming clouds in the chilly air as he examined the shelter's interior. Inside the journal was a folded letter, its edges worn and stained with what appeared to be coffee or whiskey. The unsigned note spoke in cryptic, almost poetic language about the woman who trusted too much, and described with unsettling accuracy the layout of Margaret's campsite, the position of her tent relative to the river, the arrangement of her cooking supplies, even the blue bandana she'd hung from a branch to mark her location. "This is no coincidence," the detective muttered, carefully placing the letter in an evidence bag. The handwriting, slanted and precise, seemed vaguely familiar to him. Back at the station, Emily Turner's hands trembled as she examined photographs of the letter. "This person knew my mother's camp," she whispered. "They were watching her." Forensic analysts compared the handwriting to notes left in trail logs that summer. The distinctive way the writer formed their lowercase r and the unusual spacing between words created a match that sent chills through the investigation team. The author had signed several trail logs as L.B. during the week of Margaret's disappearance. "Lucas Bennett," Clark confirmed, spreading the trail logs across the table. He was documenting his movements. Perhaps without realizing it, the most disturbing entry appeared 3 days after Margaret vanished. "The river claims what belongs to it. The careless leave, but never return." Emily's face paled as she read the words. "He's talking about my mother, isn't he?" The detective nodded grimly. "We believe so. But Bennett vanished shortly after, another ghost in the wilderness." The letter revealed something else, knowledge of the terrain that only experienced locals possessed. Bennett had described shortcuts and hidden viewpoints that weren't on any official maps. He'd been watching, planning, perhaps for days before Margaret disappeared. Yet for all the evidence the letter provided, it created as many questions as answers. The writer seemed both remorseful and proud, leaving cryptic references to necessary actions and the wilderness deciding who belongs. By nightfall, the letter had been catalogued as crucial evidence. But the author remained elusive, a shadow that had touched Margaret's final days and then dissolved back into the vast Alaskan wilderness, leaving only paper and ink as proof of his existence. Emily Turner sat on the edge of her hotel bed, staring at the photographs spread across the faded floral comforter. Each image represented a piece of her mother's final days. The recovered duffel bag, the journal entries, the maritime knots that had sealed Margaret's fate. The conflicting emotions within her chest felt like two opposing currents, relief at finally having answers, and the crushing weight of knowing justice might never come. "We've tracked his movement across the Canadian border," Detective Samuel Clark explained during their morning meeting at the small Talkeetna police station. "Lucas Bennett used his passport at a crossing point in Yukon 3 days after your mother disappeared. After that, he essentially vanished." The detective had shown her a grainy border camera image, Lucas with his distinct plaid shirt and confident stride, walking away as if he carried no burden. Emily remembered how her fingers had trembled as she touched the screen, inches away from the man who had likely taken everything from her. "Is there nothing we can do?" she had asked, her voice barely audible above the hum of the station's ancient air conditioner. Clark had sighed, running his hand through his greying hair. "We've flagged his information with Canadian authorities, but without a body." He left the sentence unfinished, the implication hanging heavily between them. Now alone in her room, Emily opened her laptop and began searching. What she discovered made her stomach turn. Lucas had a pattern: 3 separate incidents involving female hikers in remote areas of British Columbia and Montana. In each case, the women had reported uncomfortable encounters with a helpful stranger who became increasingly insistent about showing them secret trails. None had enough evidence to press charges. One woman's account chilled Emily to the bone. "He knew too much about knots, kept showing me different ways to secure gear, said he'd worked on fishing boats in Alaska." Emily closed her laptop and moved to the window, watching as the Susitna River flowed endlessly in the distance. The same waters that had protected Lucas's secret for 7 years had finally betrayed him, yet not completely enough for justice to be served. She thought of her mother, meticulous Margaret, who had planned everything down to the last detail, who had trusted her own abilities, but perhaps not her instincts about people. The river had kept its silence, protecting a predator while Margaret's family searched in vain. Tomorrow, Emily would meet with the town's lawyer to discuss options for a memorial. Justice might remain elusive, but her mother's story would not be forgotten. The river had finally spoken, even if its confession came too late. The duffel bag lay on Detective Samuel Clark's desk, its weathered fabric telling a story of 7 long winters beneath the ice. Margaret Turner's initials, once proudly etched into the side, had faded to ghostly impressions. The contents, a journal with water-damaged pages, clothes folded with characteristic precision, and a scratched water bottle, offered answers, yet cruelly withheld the complete truth. "It's enough to know she didn't just wander off," Emily whispered, running her fingers along the edge of her mother's journal. The detective nodded solemnly. The maritime knots binding the bag, the deliberate weighing down with river stones, these weren't the actions of someone who had lost their way. They were calculated, methodical. "The evidence suggests foul play," Samuel explained gently, but without... He hesitated, unwilling to speak. The words both knew hung in the air between them. "Without a body," Emily finished for him, her voice steadier than she felt. The absence of her mother's remains meant no DNA evidence linking Lucas Bennett directly to the crime, no cause of death to pursue in court. The Susitna River had preserved just enough to confirm their suspicions, but erased the proof needed for justice. Emily turned to the window, watching spring rain trace patterns down the glass of the police station. 7 years of searching, of clinging to hope while preparing for heartbreak, had led to this moment of incomplete closure. The duffel bag confirmed what she had feared in her darkest moments, but had never wanted to believe. "Your mother was meticulous," Detective Clark said, carefully closing the evidence folder. "Her journal entries show she documented everything: trail markers, weather conditions, even her encounters with other hikers." He didn't add what they both understood. That same careful nature made it unlikely she would have taken unnecessary risks. Emily nodded, remembering her mother's planning before the trip. The maps spread across the dining table, the checklists. The satellite phone she'd invested in. Margaret Turner had respected the wilderness too much to approach it unprepared. "She fought," Emily said suddenly, certainty filling her voice. "Whatever happened, she didn't go easily." The detective's eyes softened. The evidence supports that. The scratches on the water bottle appear defensive. Emily gathered her mother's belongings, now sealed in evidence bags. These items, these fragments of a life interrupted, would never provide the complete picture. The river had claimed too much, and Lucas Bennett remained a shadow beyond their reach. As she left the station, Emily carried with her the hardest truth of all. Some questions would never be answered. But she also carried something else, the certainty that Margaret Turner had faced her end with the same strength and determination that had defined her life. Word of Margaret Turner's discovered belongings spread through Talkeetna like wildfire. The small Alaskan community, once divided in their opinions about the disappearance, now united in collective grief and reflection. On a clear evening, as the late spring sun cast long shadows across the town, residents gathered at the riverbank where Thomas had made his grim discovery. The old fisherman who had spent countless hours searching these same waters 7 years ago stood in solemn silence, their weathered faces etched with a mixture of vindication and sorrow. Men who had once doubted a city woman's ability to navigate the wilderness now removed their caps in respect. "She was tougher than most of us gave her credit for," muttered Harold, a local guide who had initially suggested Margaret had simply gotten lost and succumbed to the elements. Emily Turner stood at the center of the gathering, her shoulders straighter than they had been in years. The daughter accepted the condolences of strangers who now felt like family, each sharing memories of the search efforts or small interactions they'd had with her mother. "Your mum checked the fishing reports at my counter," said the owner of the grocery store. "She knew exactly what she was doing out there." Thomas Baker remained at the edge of the crowd, unable to shake the memory of his discovery. The fisherman's hands still felt the chill of the icy water as he'd untied those peculiar knots. The scraping sound of stones shifting against the duffel bag echoed in his dreams. He'd been fishing that stretch of the Susitna River for 30 years, but now each visit carried the weight of Margaret's story. "I keep thinking about how long it was there," Thomas confided to Detective Clark, who stood nearby documenting the informal memorial. "How many times I might have passed right by it, never knowing." Samuel Clark nodded sympathetically. The detective understood the burden of discovery all too well. "You gave Emily something precious," he said quietly. "The beginning of answers." As twilight deepened, candles were lit along the shore, their flames reflecting in the dark water. A local pastor offered words of comfort, speaking of closure and healing. Though everyone knew the story remained unfinished, while Lucas Bennett walked free. Emily placed a framed photograph of her mother at the water's edge, Margaret smiling confidently with mountains rising behind her. The community of Talkeetna, once just a dot on her mother's adventure map, had become the keeper of her memory. As darkness fell completely, the residents dispersed slowly, carrying with them a shared determination that Margaret Turner's story would not be forgotten. And perhaps someday justice would follow truth from the depths. Detective Samuel Clark closed the manila folder with a sigh that carried the weight of 7 years. He placed it in the filing cabinet alongside dozens of other cases, some solved, others still haunting the small precinct in Talkeetna. This one would remain somewhere in between. "We know what happened," he muttered to himself, straightening his desk. But knowing isn't enough. The evidence told a story. Margaret Turner had encountered Lucas Bennett, trusted him as many travelers do in remote places, and paid the ultimate price. The maritime knots on the duffel bag, the scratched water bottle that likely recorded her final moments, the carefully weighted stones, all pointed to premeditation. But the detective knew that evidence degraded by years in the Susitna River wouldn't stand up in court. Clark had distributed Bennett's description to authorities across Alaska and Canada. The man had vanished like morning mist, possibly using another identity by now. The detective had seen this before. predators who moved between wilderness areas, targeting those who traveled alone. They counted on nature to hide their crimes. "We'll find him eventually," he promised the photograph of Margaret that had sat on his desk since Emily first brought it in. Her smiling face, framed against a backdrop of mountains, seemed to understand the limitations of justice in places where humans were merely visitors. Across town, Emily Turner sat at her computer, fingers hovering over the keyboard. The blinking cursor waited for words that would capture her mother's spirit and serve as warning to others. She had spent 7 years searching for Margaret. Now she would ensure her story lived on. "Mom always said that preparation wasn't enough," she whispered to the empty room. "You needed instinct, too." Emily began typing, describing her mother's meticulous planning, her decades of dreaming about Alaska's wilderness, and her fatal mistake, trusting a stranger with a plausible story and helpful advice. The daughter crafted each paragraph carefully, balancing between honoring Margaret's adventurous spirit and warning about the dangers that lurk beyond trail maps. She included photographs, her mother standing proudly beside her car, packed for adventure, the campsite as rangers had found it, the river that had kept secrets for so long. Each image told part of a story that Emily was only now able to piece together. When Thomas Baker called to check on her progress, Emily explained her vision, a book that would be part memoir, part cautionary tale. "Your mother would be proud," the fisherman said softly. "She was brave until the end," Emily nodded, though no one could see, "and now her courage will help others stay safe." As darkness fell over Talkeetna, 2 people worked toward different kinds of justice, one through the law, however imperfect, and one through memory, however painful. The summer market in Talkeetna had transformed into something more than a place for tourists to buy handcrafted souvenirs and local produce. Now, the colorful stalls and bustling pathways held a deeper significance for the tight-knit community. At the entrance, a vibrant mural captured the essence of Margaret Turner. Her confident smile and knowing eyes seemed to follow visitors as they passed. The local artists had painted her exactly as those who knew her remembered, determined, alive with purpose, ready for adventure. Emily Turner visited the mural whenever she returned to Alaska. She would stand quietly, sometimes touching the painted outline of her mother's hand, finding comfort in the community's effort to preserve Margaret's memory. The market vendors, once strangers to the Turner family, now greeted her by name. "Your mother changed this town." Abigail, the elderly woman who sold knitted hats, would say, "She taught us all something important." Tourists inevitably asked about the story behind the mural. They'd point to Margaret's face. Curiosity piqued by the inscription beneath, "Trust the wilderness, but know your companions." The locals had developed a routine response, a gentle warning wrapped in the narrative of what happened 7 years ago. "Always sign the trail logs," Thomas Baker would explain while selling his fresh catch. The fisherman's eyes would drift toward the river whenever he spoke of that fateful discovery. "And tell someone exactly where you're heading." Detective Clark occasionally visited the market during the summer months. He would stand at a distance, watching the interactions, still carrying the weight of the unsolved case. Though the evidence pointed clearly to Lucas Bennett, the Canadian traveler had vanished without a trace across the border. "Never ignore that feeling in your gut," the detective would advise when asked. Margaret sensed something was wrong. "We found it in her journal. She just didn't act on it soon enough." The mural had become more than a memorial. It was a silent sentinel, a reminder that even the most prepared adventurer could be betrayed by misplaced trust. Parents pointed it out to their children, hikers studied it before heading into the wilderness, and locals nodded respectfully as they passed. On quiet evenings when the market closed, The painted eyes of Margaret seemed to watch over the town she had briefly visited, but permanently changed. Her story had woven itself into the fabric of Talkeetna, a cautionary tale that saved others by teaching them to balance adventure with vigilance. "Check on your neighbors" became the town's unofficial motto, and never venture alone with someone you've just met. The Susitna River never remained the same. With each passing season, its banks morphed and shifted, carving new paths through the Alaskan wilderness. Spring thaws and summer floods rearranged stones, uprooted trees, and reshaped the landscape that had once swallowed Margaret Turner's story. Nature's constant transformation seemed fitting for a place that had both concealed and revealed such a profound mystery. The spot where Thomas Baker discovered the weathered duffel bag evolved into something unexpected. Without fanfare or official designation, locals began stacking riverstones there, first just 3 or 4, then dozens, forming a small cairn. The fisherman himself placed the first stone, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he selected a smooth, flat rock from the riverbank. Others followed his example, creating an impromptu memorial that grew with each visitor. Emily Turner added her own stone during her next visit, placing it carefully atop the pile while whispering words only the river could hear. Detective Samuel Clark stopped by occasionally, standing in contemplative silence before adding another stone to the growing monument. Even tourists, hearing fragments of Margaret's story from locals at the market or bakery, would make the journey to leave their contribution. As months stretched into years, national media attention predictably waned. The case file gathered dust in official archives, and Margaret's face no longer appeared in newspaper headlines. Yet in Talkeetna, her memory remained woven into the community's fabric. The riverside shrine stood as a quiet testament to collective grief and remembrance. During the annual spring breakup, when ice cracked and thundered down the Susitna, locals would gather at safe vantage points to watch nature's dramatic performance. Many swore they could hear something beyond the physical sounds of rushing water and grinding ice, a faint whisper, a lingering presence. "That's Margaret," the older residents would say, nodding knowingly, still exploring her river. The cairn would sometimes collapse under winter's heavy snows or spring's violent floods, but someone always rebuilt it. Thomas often took it upon himself, feeling a connection to the woman whose belongings he'd discovered. He'd arranged the stones with care, speaking aloud as if Margaret might be listening. "The river gives and takes," he explained to a young fisher who asked about the stone pile. "But it can't wash away memory, not completely." And so the Susitna continued its eternal cycle of freezing and thawing, concealing and revealing, while Margaret Turner's spirit remained, carried in the river's persistent song and in the hearts of those who refused to forget. Emily Turner found healing in unexpected places. After years of searching for answers about her mother's disappearance, she discovered that closure wasn't found in the final pieces of evidence, but in the community that had formed around her quest. The people of Talkeetna, who had once viewed her with the cautious distance they reserved for all outsiders, now embraced her as one of their own. "You've got your mother's determination," Thomas Baker told her one evening at the local grocery store, his weathered hands gripping a carton of milk. The fisherman who had discovered Margaret's bag still carried that day with him, but he'd found his own peace in watching Emily's transformation. The town's summer market, once just a place where Lucas Bennett had lurked selling trinkets while observing potential victims, became Emily's Saturday ritual. She set up a small table not to distribute flyers anymore, but to share trail safety information with tourists and locals alike. Detective Samuel Clark visited occasionally, bringing coffee and updates on the continuing search for Bennett. Though the trail had gone cold, Emily appreciated his dedication. "Your mother would be proud," he'd say, and for the first time, those words brought comfort rather than pain. Emily began organizing weekend hiking groups specifically for women. They started with short trails near town, where she taught them to read the landscape, mark their paths, and trust their instincts about strangers. My mother was careful," she would explain, "but she didn't know what to watch for. You will." On these hikes, Emily shared stories of Margaret Turner's courage and love for the wilderness. The retired teacher's spirit seemed to walk alongside them through the towering pines and along the rushing waters of the Susitna. The women learned to balance awe with awareness, appreciation with caution. "Always leave breadcrumbs" became Emily's mantra. She showed them how to use digital check-ins, trail logs, and emergency contacts. Each woman carried a small notebook, recording observations and marking their presence on the land, small acts of defiance against the silence that had nearly swallowed her mother's story. The bakery owner, who had once reluctantly posted Margaret's flyers, now saved Emily's favorite sourdough bread. The gas station attendant waved whenever she drove past. These small gestures of belonging healed something in her that investigations and evidence never could. 7 years after Margaret vanished, Emily finally understood that her mother's legacy wasn't just a cautionary tale. It was also a story of how tragedy could forge unbreakable bonds between strangers, turning them into family. In this remote Alaskan town, Emily had found not just answers, but a home. The Susitna River continues its ancient dance, carving new paths through the Alaskan wilderness with each passing season. Though its waters still harbor countless untold stories, Margaret Turner's tale has finally emerged from the depths. Her disappearance, once a haunting question mark in Talkeetna's history, now stands as a somber reminder that nature's vastness can conceal human cruelty, but not forever. Emily Turner stands at the river's edge, watching the late spring sun dissolve the remaining patches of snow. 7 years of searching have transformed her from a desperate daughter into something else entirely. A guardian of memory, a keeper of truth. The community that once viewed her with awkward pity now embraces her as their own, bound by the shared experience of loss and discovery. The river gives back what it takes. Thomas Baker tells visitors who ask about the weathered memorial stones stacked near his favorite fishing spot. The fisherman's weathered hands still tremble slightly when he recounts finding the duffel bag that changed everything. It's just a matter of time. Detective Samuel Clark never officially closed the case. Though Lucas Bennett remains at large, his shadow grows fainter with each passing year. The maritime knots, the journal entries, the unsigned letter, all pieces of a puzzle that revealed enough truth for healing, if not perfect justice. "We may never know everything," Emily explains to the women who join her monthly safety hikes, "but we know enough." Her guided expeditions have become something of a pilgrimage for female adventurers, a way to honor her mother's spirit while ensuring others don't share her fate. Each participant leaves with practical knowledge and an unspoken understanding. Trust your instincts. Leave traces. Remember that even in wilderness, community matters. The town's summer market bustles with activity beneath the watchful gaze of Margaret's mural. Local artisans sell handmade trinkets while visitors pause to read the small plaque detailing her story. Children who weren't even born when she vanished now grow up knowing her name, understanding that the wilderness demands both respect and caution. As twilight settles over the mountains, Emily closes her mother's journal and places it back in its special box. The pages have been read so many times, the binding has begun to crack, but the words remain clear, a testament to a woman who faced the unknown with courage. The Susitna continues its timeless flow, ice melting into rushing currents that reshape the landscape with each passing year. And in this constant change, there is a strange comfort. Nothing stays hidden forever. The truth, like water, always finds its way to the light,